Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Karen Quinlan and I'm the Director of the National Portrait Gallery of Australia. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, who are the traditional custodians of the Canberra region, on whose lands the gallery stands. I would like to pay my respect to the elders past, present and emerging and recognise their ongoing connections to culture and country. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all here tonight. I'm delighted to see so many people here at the gallery and many, many more of you who are tuning in to the debate from home. The National Portrait Gallery's mission is to reflect the face of Australia, to unpack what it is to be Australian and to express our identity in all of its guises. We encourage ongoing discussions about Australian identity, and although these discussions often stray into controversial territory, we are up for the debate, as long as it is done in a climate of respect and courtesy. So let that be a guide for you all this evening. I would like to welcome Bell Shakespeare back to the National Portrait Gallery. I believe wholeheartedly in collaboration between arts organisations, and the Portrait Gallery takes great pride in its association with Bell Shakespeare on this occasion. At a time when the arts have been hard hit by the effects of the COVID pandemic, we will continue to explore meaningful ways in which we can partner with friends like Bell Shakespeare to augment our audience, to help each other build brand awareness, and to continue to reveal the timelessness of human stories. I welcome Jill Perkins, the CEO of Bell Shakespeare, and Peter Evans, Bell Shakespeare's Artistic Director. And I thank you sincerely for choosing the Portrait Gallery as a venue for this special debate. Importantly, I welcome Minister Fletcher back to the Portrait Gallery. We know this has been a very challenging year for the arts sector, and we are deeply grateful for his support and the government's support, which enables us to continue to invest in Australian artists and Australian audiences. So now it gives me great pleasure to welcome Jill Perkins to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen. May I also acknowledge and pay my respect to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, and also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands of our online audience joining us across Australia. Bell Shakespeare is also delighted to be back in Canberra and doubly delighted to be here in partnership with our friends at the National Portrait Gallery to present the second in our debate series in celebration of the company's 30th anniversary year. It is our pleasure to partner with an organisation that is also focused on telling stories about people, and often people of renown. In their case, it is through portraiture, and in our case, it's through performance. We too very much look forward to growing this partnership, and I thank them for their generosity and warmth. I also welcome Federal Arts Minister, the Honourable Paul Fletcher, returning to a Bell Shakespeare debating team after a hiatus of about 25 years, I think. In a previous life, he participated in our inaugural debate series in the early 90s, which was held in Sydney. Of course, with the continued advancements in technology, we can now open up opportunities to people all over Australia, not just those in capital cities. That is, and always has been, central to Bell Shakespeare's vision and mission. I also welcome our friends and colleagues at Canberra Theatre Centre and our many partner organisations and donors who, along with government, quite literally keep Bell Shakespeare on the road. I particularly thank tonight's event partners, Low Key Productions, who are helping us stream this debate nationally, Avolo Nishi, who are our Canberra hotel partner, the magnificent Tyrrell's Wines, and Broadbean Catering. Now it is my very great pleasure to introduce your host for this evening, Bell Shakespeare Board Director and founder of Faraday Associates, Mr. Lachlan Edwards. Thank you.
Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. We come to bury truth, not to praise it. Welcome to this, the second of the Bell Shakespeare debates for 2020. My name is Lachlan Edwards, and my job as the moderator of tonight's debate is to cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war. But before we do, Bell Shakespeare would also like to recognise the traditional owners of the land on which we are gathered tonight. And of course, we're gathered tonight not just as the 80 people in this room, and by the way, I haven't been in a room with 80 people for about 8 months, but there's about 500 or 600 people who are watching online tonight. And so we thank all of you, but in NAIDOC Week, we particularly recognise the traditional owners of this land. We're in a building that's 22 years old, in a city that was named only 107 years ago. We're debating a quote from a playwright who was born 456 years ago, and it's from one of his plays about a man who died 2,064 years ago. But we're on land where the people who lived on this land have been telling their stories as part of their continuous association of this land for 60,000 years. So we acknowledge them, and we acknowledge the fact that they tell their stories, and we pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and we hope to honour their traditions tonight with this very contemporary debate. We're delighted to be broadcasting tonight live on the web, and I'd like to extend a warm welcome to our viewers from all around Australia and the world. In particular, I welcome anyone from the United States who's watching, who will soon be liberated from being bound in shallows and miseries. Maybe. Tonight is part of the ongoing celebration of Bell Shakespeare's 30th anniversary. In November 1990, almost 30 years ago to the day, John Bell, who is a man who doth bestride the narrow world like a colossus, modestly opened this National Shakespeare Company with a performance of Hamlet in a tent. The dream was to share and perform Shakespeare's incredible body of work, be true to the text, but tell these stories in a particularly Australian way, with Australian voices and contemporary context, and this remains our mission to this day. In 2020, we have strived with things impossible, and yet we have not performed in theatres despite our efforts. But we have stayed true to the mission. We've been an integral part of the first Shakespeare play performed in the Noongar language, which is the language of the Indigenous people of Western Australia. We've broadcast these debates on YouTube. We've created a series of amazing podcasts called Speak the Speech, and we've performed to over 120,000 children across all of Australia. And our players, I'm delighted to say, are now playing in the schools again. The vision of Bell Shakespeare remains to make Shakespeare accessible for all Australians, regardless of age, geographic location, or socio-economic challenges. And haven't there been a few of those in 2020? So, from the 6 bastardized quotes that I used in my introduction, you may have gathered that tonight's topic comes from Julius Caesar. The quote is actually, "The fault, dear Brutus, is not in the stars but in ourselves." And it comes from Julius Caesar, so fitting for Canberra. And those words are uttered by Cassius to Brutus. Cassius with his lean and hungry look. Caesar preferred fat men around him, so I would have been a Caesar favourite. But I think the important thing is to say that this topic is all about whether we are masters of our fates. And of course, a spoiler alert for those of you who don't know the play, it didn't work out well for Brutus, Cassius, or Caesar. So just to be clear, dear audience, the affirmative team will argue that the fault is in ourselves. The negative team will argue that the fault is in our stars. Now, before I welcome our speakers, I have a task for you, the audience, both here and afar. There's a link which you will need. So please, everyone always says, put away your phone. Well, tonight we're saying take out your phone. If you go to the Bell Shakespeare website or the YouTube page for this debate, or for those of you here, if you did the right thing and used the QR code, you'll find that there's something called the Mentimeter voting page. And once you're in, including Andrew, once you're in, and I'd like you to go in now, I'd like you to tell us now, before we start, whether you agree or disagree with the prospect that the fault is not in our stars but in ourselves. When you've submitted your answer, you'll be prompted as to whether you have any questions for our debaters, and you can use that throughout the evening, and those questions will be provided to me, and I will pick some of them, not all of them, and we will put those to our debaters at the end of the debate. Later, I'm going to ask you to vote again, and let's see how you feel about our topic after having heard our speakers tonight. So, now it's time to introduce our teams. Speaking for the affirmative, the heavens themselves will blaze forth for our first speaker. Please welcome a woman who has almost graduated from the Australian National University and for whom the quality of mercy is not strained. In her short career, she has already run a women's mentoring program, volunteered for youth-led NGOs and community legal centres. It barely seems possible. She's just started her career in law, so please, let's not the first thing we kill all the lawyers, but rather welcome the first speaker for the affirmative, Phyllida Behm. Also from the ANU, at slightly the other end of the spectrum, is a professor with a research interest in the rise of populism. Who would have thought that would be useful? He's our second affirmative speaker, a man who knows the treachery of this town like a Roman senator aware that it is every day that's the Ides of March. Mark is a director of the National Press Club, a former journalist of the Sydney Morning Herald, The Age and the Canberra Times, and a regular on ABC's Insider programs. Please welcome Mark Kenny. Our third affirmative, who is the captain of the affirmative team tonight, is also a regular on the Insiders program. She lights up our lives on Sunday morning like the sun over the lions at the Colosseum. She's the Guardian Australia's political correspondent, but less well known is that she once covered garden shows and Queensland politics. But I repeat myself. With no known connection to the Australian National University, she is the captain of the affirmative team, Amy Remeikis. So, affirmative team, how are we feeling? Limbered up, ready to take it on? Yes. Phyllida got a last assignment in on Friday.
Yes, I'm still kind of unwinding from that.
Very good. And what better way to do it than perform in front of 600 people?
Yeah, it's
excellent.
fun.
Right. So, let's welcome the negative team. The captain of the negative team and its first speaker has been practicing for tonight's debate since he and I joined the debating team in Year 8 in 1979. Despite being part of the executive leadership team of ASIC and chairing the board of our dear friends over at the Griffin Theatre Company, they say his life is gentle and the elements so mixed in him that nature might stand up and say to all the world, this was a man, but this is Bruce Marr. Speaking for the negative team in the second position is our true star tonight. There is no one more famous in Canberra than a woman who presented for the ABC News right up until 2016. She now chairs the 50 by 50 Foundation, the 50 by 50 by 2030 Foundation at Canberra University, which is not the ANU, for those of you interstate. And no wonder she wrote the book called Wonder Woman. Please welcome the extraordinary Virginia Haussegger AM. The final negative speaker is a man who in 2019 spent $180 billion on Social Security, when $180 billion was still a lot of money. Now, as the Minister for Communications and, most importantly, the arts, he's increased record funding for the arts, for which we at Bell Shakespeare and many other companies are eternally grateful. Like Caesar, He's as constant as the North Star, of whose true fixed and resting quality there is no fellow in the firmament. He is the Honourable Fletcher MP. So I think Jill may have alluded to this in the introduction, but in addition to having Virginia as their star, both Bruce and Paul actually spoke in the original Bell debates. So you've been here before. Is it? Not here literally. How are we feeling 140 years later?
Pretty good.
Good.
Pretty good. We're confident, yeah.
It's great to be back. Great to be at the National Portrait Gallery, part of the arts portfolio, one of the wonderful national collecting institutions here in Canberra.
Very politically correct. Thank you, Minister. So welcome to the affirmative and negative teams. So, speakers, you will have 6 minutes each, and you will hear a warning bell at 5 minutes. That means you only have 1 minute left, so wrap it up. And please don't be alarmed by the fact that at the end of each speech, our COVID safety marshal, Alex, is going to run onto the stage and wipe down the podium with antibacterial wipes between each speaker. So before I misquote any further Shakespeare, let us debate "The fault is not in the stars but in ourselves." I would like to start the debate by calling on the first affirmative speaker, Phyllida Behm.
Hello everyone. I'd like to start by thanking Bell Shakespeare for having me here tonight. It's a great privilege and I've really been looking forward to it. So tonight, Mark, Amy and I will be arguing that the fault is not in our stars but in ourselves. The question at the heart of this topic is about agency. That is, can we attribute things that happen only to ourselves or to forces greater than ourselves? Are we led by destiny or fate, or by our own free choice? We on the affirmative argue the latter, and I think that this is a message of hope and optimism. In the face of oppression, we on the affirmative believe that it is possible to act to make change. Rather than sit back and let the world happen to us, we're the team that wants to do something about the problems that we're confronted by. I'll start by talking about political participation and accountability, and then Mark is going to follow with a slightly more philosophical approach, and then Amy's going to conclude and respond to our learned opposition. First, let's situate this topic in the context of the play. Julius Caesar has just returned victorious from battle, and he's met with huge public celebrations. His base love him. The Make Rome Great Again caps sell out like crazy. But Senators Brutus and Cassius are concerned by Caesar's increasingly tyrannical tendencies, and Brutus is genuinely worried that Caesar is going to make a grab for power and undermine Rome's republican institutions. So to convince him to take a stand, Cassius says to Brutus that men at some time are masters of their fates. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves that we are underlings. So, what do you do when you're faced with an autocrat? Well, we all know it doesn't go so well for Brutus. But we are lucky enough to live in a democratic society in which politics isn't just something that happens to you, but something that you participate in. Indeed, just last week we saw hundreds of millions of Americans turning out to vote in the face of huge adversity presented by the coronavirus pandemic. We cast off the yoke of oppression not through tyrannicide, but through political participation. Imagine for a moment the alternative position, which I'm sure the negative is just about to tell you, to believe that your actions don't matter and that you can't create change is a shockingly apathetic perspective. It's not a perspective that we should encourage in a democratic society in which representation and participation matters so that everybody has a voice that can be heard. And indeed, it's not something that we encourage in our country where we have a system of compulsory voting. On the affirmative, we rally against the apathy of the opposition and we maintain that government, who's in it, what it looks like and what it does for us, is up to us, and it should be up to us. Imagine further if Victorians hadn't believed over the past few months that their small actions could make a difference. To think that the second wave of coronavirus was fated to happen in Victoria and that there was nothing to be done about it would have led to hundreds of more deaths. By taking matters into their own hands and committing to a very arduous lockdown, Victorians literally saved lives. And I would rather celebrate that as a conscious achievement than to think of coronavirus as something that happens outside of our control, because the reality is that we can control the extent of the spread of the virus to a great degree. So that's our perspective on political participation. But I think there's also a point to be made briefly about accountability. I'm sure that for all of us, there have been moments in our lives where we've made mistakes that we would rather forget and chalk up to someone or something else. But taking responsibility for our actions is important. It's the only way that we can grow and to change and to improve, and the people that we wrong deserve an honest explanation as to our failings. It just wouldn't fly if a Member of Parliament, for example, stood up and said, "Well, I'm sorry I misspent taxpayer money. The fault is in my stars. What can I say?" We expect more from our leaders, and we expect to be able to hold them to account for their own actions. Moving to a different Shakespearean play, let's think about the example of Romeo and Juliet. In one sense, they are star-crossed lovers because I suppose that the fact they can't be together and their eventual demise isn't caused by their own actions. But I don't think that this can be chalked up to destiny or fate. I think that their families have to be held accountable for the petty feud that kept them apart and ultimately led to their deaths. And indeed, this is who the prince blames at the end of the play when he says, "Capulet, Montague, see what scourge is laid upon your hate, that heaven finds means to kill your joys with love." We on the affirmative refuse the temptation to blame anyone but ourselves for our failings. It's only through being held accountable and taking responsibility that we can ever change. Indeed, if we lose the debate tonight, we only have ourselves to blame, although I understand that there's a voting mechanism, so maybe we have the audience to blame, which might get ugly, so watch out. One thing I'm sure we can all agree on, though, is the enduring relevance of William Shakespeare's plays. I now imagine Caesar as a slightly overweight orange man with a toupee and an overactive Twitter account, which I'm sure is not how William Shakespeare envisioned him. So on that note, I'd like you to join Mark and Amy and I in participating and taking responsibility for our actions, because the fault is not in our stars, it's in ourselves. Thank you.
So, for the record, I don't have a toupee. And in fact, I don't have a Twitter account, so I think I'm okay on this. Thank you, Phyllida, so much. The captain and the first speaker of the negative team tonight, as I mentioned earlier, is a very old and dear friend, and all I have to say is, et tu, Brute.
Thank you, Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, well, I think you'll see that the battle lines are drawn, and I think you'll see who's on your side as we go through this debate tonight. But Lachlan, let me just say, I think you're looking particularly handsome this evening, and your face radiates intelligence. In fact, I could say similar things about the entire audience here tonight, which is hardly surprising because in debating circles, Canberra audiences are widely known to be sophisticated and debonair. And while I can't see the audiences online, it being a Bell crowd, I'm sure they cut above the rest. They are a cut above the rest, I should say. Now, I understand that you will be deciding tonight's debate based on an audience vote. And I am confident that if you count only the legal votes and throw out the illegal votes, we will win bigly, if you get my drift. Now, the way I sort of in my own mind frame this is a bit about my own approach to professional life, which is that I have never had and will never do a job where my performance can be measured or assessed. That's why I do what's called corporate communications, which is a fancy name for PR and particularly useless. But no one can ever say to me, your KPI says you are going to produce 100 widgets and I only see 95. And I'm guessing that any good public servant here with us tonight appreciates the absolute imperative of not being the one left holding the baby. Before I start, there are a couple of definitional issues which we need to address. First, and this is very important, the word fault in this topic is critical. It implies a negative attribute or an outcome. Therefore, we will argue that no one here needs to take responsibility for anything that goes wrong. But if it's a success, jump in. Take full credit. You deserve it. Secondly, we take the stars as a very broad concept. It sort of means the cosmos, so we can basically argue anything. Now, you're a bright lot, so you've worked out that the speakers on this side are your friends. We have no plan to burden you with personal responsibility or the inevitable guilt that follows. And we've already heard the reference to the United States. Well, while in polite society, I'm sure that we will all be saying that the United States and the world needs a decent bloke like Joe Biden with his Trump-esque, the buck stops here approach. His Truman-esque, the buck stop here approach. And it probably does. But be honest with yourself. If it were you, wouldn't you rather be kicking back in the residence of the White House, eating cheeseburgers and watching sycophants on Fox News telling you what a great guy you were? I know I would. So, as the negative, we have some highly cogent arguments, and as the President would say, they're beautiful. They are the most beautiful arguments. That doesn't mean they have to be consistent. It doesn't mean they have to be logical, because we don't have to take responsibility for that sort of stuff. But at least you'll have a choice. If you don't like my arguments, you'll probably love Virginia's, and if you don't love Virginia's, you'll love Paul's. It's very simple. So in order to advance our case, I will examine how people can shift responsibility to saints and celebrities. One of them in the heavens, the others are literally stars. Virginia will examine the mysteries of the horoscope, an obvious celestial connection. Paul, being a politician, will take a less elevated approach. For him, the topic could be reframed as "the fault is not in myself, but in my staff." Being a good Catholic boy, like my old chum Lachlan there, I'm aware that there's a patron saint for everything imaginable. Now, as a Catholic, you could also go to confession and have your sins wiped out that way, but just a bit too much effort when you can just let a saintly do-gooder take the blame. Lost your keys, wallet, your 4-year-old? St Anthony of Padua will find them for you. Is your business losing money hand over fist? Let St Jude, patron saint of lost causes, take on the insolvency risk. Is your organisation facing a public relations disaster on a scale similar to that overwhelming ASIC at the moment? Tell your boss St Bernardino of Siena, the patron saint of PR, is letting you down. It's worked for me so far. And presumably patron saints need people to patronise, so if you're butt ugly, blame St Drogo, the patron saint of unattractive people, for making you so. If you're disappointed with your children, St Clotilde is responsible for the little runt's shortcomings. See how easy it is? Now, this is an example of how clever people, who've been educated by the Jesuits, can take control and shift blame to others. But another category of people are the gullible, and this is where the celebrities come in. I mean, it was bad enough when Paris Hilton pioneered the velour tracksuit, or Britney Spears was promoting the visible thong, and I mean that in the American sense. With Instagram, millions have handed responsibility for their fashion and lifestyle to a small army of influencers, mostly named Jenner or Kardashian. They promote ludicrous fads to an adoring audience, fads such as drinking your own urine, using breast milk in tea, covering your skin in your own blood, thanks Kim, or vaginal sunbathing. One of the most prominent is Gwyneth Paltrow and her Goop products and treatments. For some reason, many of them also focus on the vagina, including jade eggs to be inserted, a steaming treatment, don't know how that works, and a candle branded as a "this smells like my vagina" candle. The brain-dead 21st century customers lap it up. So obviously, if you're gullible, you're not to blame. Someone will always try to take advantage. But if you're smart, like everyone in this room and on this broadcast, you'll realise that there are plenty of people, and saints, to blame, and you'd be crazy to cop the opprobrium of your cock-ups. Te absolvo.
There is so much of that speech I'm going to leave alone. But I would say this, there will be no late mail-in votes tonight. So with that, I would like to see the affirmative case carried on, and I welcome to the stage Mark Kenny.
Well, thank you very much. I feel that in rebuttal, I would really just like to play that speech again. I'm going to lift the tone somewhat. The fault is not in the stars, but in ourselves. For our opponents, this statement is psychologically overwhelming. For this assortment of spiritualists, tarot card readers and mystical soothsayers, fate obliviates reason, a catch-all explanation for the capriciousness of everything. For occupants of modernity, though, the opposite is true. The fault lying with us suggests agency, responsibility, and the tantalising prospect of improvement. In his To Be or Not to Be soliloquy, Shakespeare's Hamlet frames the question for us. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them. Let me say, 'tis nothing nobler in the mind, or noble in the mind, in abandoning reason, in conferring responsibility to the faceless dictates of destiny. To take arms against the sea of troubles, on the other hand, is to think. It is to seize one's humanity. This debate, then, pits meek determinism against the majestic possibilities of human endeavour. It is about personal accountability versus feckless abandon, the vibrancy of human ingenuity against the monochrome haze of manifest destiny. Why? Because the problems we have are our own, and the remedies we settle on will never be adequate if we refuse to confront the primary condition. Take climate change, a fact our opponents no doubt regard as natural. Abstracted from the individual in both time and scale, it seems simultaneously immense and yet comfortably distant. The cost of action and the penalty for inaction are inverted. Logic says we must pay now to avoid problems later. But politics can't cope. It doesn't exist later, it exists now, unlike the third runway at Western Sydney Airport, for which only the bill exists. The Blame It on the Universe Brigade cynically capitalise on the psychological displacement involved here. A favourite retort is that extreme weather has always occurred. I remember the Great Flood of 1922 or the droughts of the 1950s or 60s, whatever it is. And even if the atmosphere is a bit busy, what can I do about it? Nothing. It's in the stars. There is something squalid and collaborationist in submitting to an external force, the outsourcing of one's judgment, which is why there was no Scouts or Girl Guides where I grew up, no swearing allegiance to the Queen or saluting guys poncing around in big shorts and long socks. This has always been my problem with the soldiering mindset. Explicitly and by definition, the ultimate point of armies is to use lethal force, to take life when ordered, no questions asked. This requires the delegation of others to others up the command chain of one's sacred moral judgment. Knowing this in advance raises a critical question. Can one place the crucial defining human characteristic, one's moral dimension, under another's control? This is not just the disempowerment of the individual, it is the depersoning, and we know where it can lead. The German-American political theorist Hannah Arendt recognised that surrendering any form of totalising idea or authority was in some basic sense immoral. But isn't that what our opponents would have you do? They believe that free will is a modernist delusion, that all the angsting is in the end pointless. Like all the evangelists, they're selling you a seductive yet stupefying lie, that there is a greater logic, a preordained outcome you can do little about. Perhaps they'd have you abandon thought altogether in favour of a higher authority, such as God, the government, or Sky After Dark. Or they might present the future as a historical ideal, like Make America Great Again. Who knows what you'll brook in pursuit of this revisionist delusion? Perhaps you won't care as the kids are ripped from their parents at the Mexican border, or as the billionaire leader treats a deadly pandemic as if it's a politically correct beat-up. You might even cede the right to be told the truth in a collective act of democratic self-harm. If our fault is in the stars, then so too are our achievements. Thought, on the other hand, leads to questions, blind obedience to collaboration, moral retreat, a kind of death. Arendt was stunned by the artless testimony of Adolf Eichmann, one of the Holocaust architects whose evidence at trial revealed what she regarded as a stunning absence of thinking. Here was the face of systematised evil rendered, as Arendt so famously noted, in all of its procedural banality. She began thinking about thinking as intrinsically moral. Could the activity of thinking as such, she asked, could this activity be among the conditions that make men abstain from evil doing? Yet our opponents here, these beguiling and seductive automatons, would have you believe that it's all part of the plan. God, the cosmos, or perhaps just some unalterable fact of human nature. But what plan? Surely the religious have had their day, yet on they cling, nipping off an embarrassing bit here and there and rushing into the arms of science at the first whiff of athlete's foot. Crab walking from the infallibility of the Pope and one true church to the collective defences of interfaith dialogue, anything, even someone else's God, rather than human agency. Perhaps the plan is not religious but geometric. I see my friend Paul Fletcher here. He'd be happy there are 3 speakers on either side because he likes 3s, or more accurately, he likes triangles. Indeed, he's a regular Pythagoras. Keen to triangulate his affections, his former department purchased the Leppington Triangle about 3 years ago. And although it was worth about $3 million, they decided to pay $30 million. Think of the key political stumbling blocks of our times: refugees, climate change, energy policy. What have our politicians given us in response? Human nature. Don't buy it. Reason, courage, justice and education are what lifts us up. The next great step in the evolution of the species is psychological. It involves nothing less than growing up to recognise there is no God, nor stars, nor great scorekeeper in the sky. It's on us. Don't let them take fault away from you. It's all we have. It's who we are.
Now, I should have mentioned that at Bell Shakespeare, I'm the head of the development committee, which means I'm the chief beggar. So can you all please be nice to the minister? He gives us money. Yeah, I know, it's a bit late. Sorry, Minister. You know, you're always in a good debate when there's God, Jesuits and Shakespeare all being thrown in, and a little bit of Holocaust to kind of really rev it up. But it's only in Canberra you get a debate where you get an unpronounceable German philosopher thrown in. So well done, Mark. So, for the first time in their married life, to follow Mark Kenny, please welcome Virginia Haussegger AM.
Thank you. Oh, sweet husband, what strange words you speak. Hypocrite. Personal accountability and versus feckless abandon, choice versus doleful acceptance, responsibility, logic. Oh, please. If ever this esteemed public intellectual, weaver of worldly wisdoms and weaselly words, Professor Kenny, was to climb down from that ivory tower over yonder and pen his blockbuster memoir, it would be titled, "It's Not My Fault." Because that, dear friends, is his constant retort, his daily go-to phrase, his core justification for all life's failures, big and small. From IKEA constructions that fall flat at first touch, to missed deadlines, to forgotten wedding anniversaries, to white silks washed with black jeans that are never going to be white again, to booking the worst hotel in the kingdom for his wife's surprise birthday celebrations, only to accidentally book exactly the same hotel the following year because it sounded familiar. But it's not his fault. Well, sweet man, you are right. The fault is not yours, never yours. It is destined, it is in the stars. After all, you're a Scorpion. Therefore, emotion is your first response. You are born to tune into the undercurrent of any given situation, and you're skilled at knowing when to duck and weave, when to move around. Philly, dear, dear Philly. Spirited, inspiring, a leader, a teacher. These are not the paths you chose for yourself. You're a Sagittarian. And according to the Bible of Truth, the Predictions Almanac, you love to aspire to something just out of your reach, such as winning a debate. But here's the thing, you cannot and you will not, because the law of nature is your Sagittarian birth. So the holy grail of all those things you desire, that thing to which you aspire, will always be just out of your reach. But thank goodness, Amy will save the day, because Amy, she is a Gemini. Geminis know how to use language in a way that they can interpret difficult and confusing things and complex ideas into a language that you all understand. And as a Gemini, her agility and her wit will light up communication, even when your team's ideas are tosh. Ah yes, this one, her destiny is to beguile with wit. Unlike our nation's hapless leader this week, the Prime Minister, when he appeared completely witless. Scott Morrison is not a Gemini, he's a Taurus. So it was not his fault. It was not his fault, not his own self-directed autonomous fault, when he appeared this week interrupting the Minister Anne Ruston at a press conference when she attempted to answer the question, what's it like being a woman in Parliament? The PM took over in order to mansplain why MPs and bonking their staff is a very serious matter. I think that's what he was saying. And that led to yesterday's headline in the New York Times, Australia's struggle with bonk bans and manterruptions. But what we know, dear friends, while the Prime Minister might appear witless, he has not himself to blame but Uranus, which is travelling a disruptive journey through the earthly sign of Taurus this year. Ah, Taurus. It's caused many a political mishap this year. To be born under the star of Taurus makes a man steady, earthy and strong. According to my trusty almanac again, Taurans are blessed with practicality. They are builders. They create things that last, which is just as well that he's a builder, given the multi-billions of dollars the PM gave to construction and infrastructure in this year's budget, while spending on programs specifically aimed at women amounted to a trifling 0.038% of the big budget spend. Well, thank you. Well, I'll turn my back this way. Well, I'm pleased to let you know, dear friends, it is not the fault of the world's male leaders that they may get these fundamental gender equity things so very wrong. It is in the stars, it's destined, it's fated. You see, dear friends, unlike Caesar's friend Cassius, I cannot allow myself to believe that men are truly the masters of their fate. Because men's fate, whether they be underlings or powerful kings, men's fate dictates the fate of women, always in every walk of life. There's not one nation in the world in which equality is enjoyed by men and women. Not one, Australia included. There's not one nation in the world right now in which women have the same economic opportunities as men. Now, I know you're thinking right now, what's this got to do with the fate of man and choice? With how personal accountability versus feckless abandon, as my learned friend put it. Well, stay with me. Let's see how feckless abandon, when you think about it, really could be described as criminal neglect by men, all men who claim to be self-directing and in full control of their fate, and therefore women's fate too. Across the globe, in every country, Australia included, men have more, they own more, they control more, they lead more, they decide more, they even sleep more than women. All that women have that is more than men is unpaid work. 1 in 3 women around the world are subjected to violence. 1 in 4 Australian women have experienced sexual or physical violence from a partner, and 2 out of 3 among our Pacific sisters. 2 out of 5 Australian women have been sexually harassed at work. On average, as we know, an Australian woman is murdered every week by a current or former partner. Now, what man willfully chooses these paths or chooses inaction and chooses bystander silence. I ask my opponents that tonight. Is this the human ingenuity you speak of? Is this self-directed choice you speak of? Does man choose that we live in a world of such horrendous gender discrimination in which power is male and poverty female? A world in which female disempowerment is so deeply entrenched, so despicable a practice that it is a choice? Friends, I don't think so. I cannot believe that. I will not believe that. I must not believe that. Man's debasement of women, cruelty and willful neglect, these are deep fault lines in our world. But if they are willful choice of man, then there's no hope, no hope. Let me believe the fault is not yours, but it's in the stars. Because then all we need to do to end this hideous misogyny that we all experience is realign the planets, fix the stars, change the cosmology. Because quite frankly, shifting the cosmos will be easier than changing mankind. Thank you.
I'm so pleased she didn't know I was an Aries. Thank you, Virginia. So, finally, to close the argument for the affirmative tonight, I'd like to call upon the third speaker, the captain of the affirmative, in the spirit of her colleague on Sunday mornings, Mike Bowers. Back to you, Amy.
Good evening. Well, I'm glad I didn't write a speech before I came here tonight because Virginia just made my case for me. I should be a Gemini, but actually I'm a Taurus because there's a 13th star sign they don't want you to know about because mankind controls everything, including the stars, so much we wiped the 13th star sign off the map. You can Google it. The fault is not in our stars, and Shakespeare knew it. He called Romeo and Juliet star-crossed lovers, as we've heard tonight, but then laughed as his characters' families drove them to delight and then ultimately death, which is how my last marriage ended. You know, figuratively. Hamlet thought it was his destiny. But then there was that whole Polonius guy telling him, you know, to thy own self be true, and didn't that work out well for him? And Othello, a universal dick if I've ever come across one in literature, trusted Iago over his beautiful and one true love. Iago actually makes Dominic Cummings look, you know, competent, so probably shouldn't be trusting someone there. Shakespeare knew it was us and not our stars which create all the questions and quandaries that we find ourselves in. The only stories where stars actually played a role in Shakespeare were the comedies, except for Catherine in Taming of the Shrew, justice for Kate at all times. If the fault was actually in our stars, they obviously have a sense of humour. Scott Morrison is our Prime Minister. He doesn't hold a telescope, mate. Paul Fletcher is our Communications Minister, responsible for the NBN, and Australia Post no longer delivering as many letters as they once did. My stars apparently have a penchant for too much chocolate, dark, broody and emotionally unavailable men, and a habit of agreeing to things like public debates when I have a crippling sense of stage fright. The stars used to be a science because mankind is always in control. If you go back to ancient Egypt, you will find tablets which tell you of conquerors coming from the west, and then people saying, hey, look, Alexander the Great turned up, we were right, many hundreds of years later. We, as I said, ignore the 13th star sign. We defund NASA
and assume that when our brightest star burns out, we'll all just move to another one. And we must be pretty eager to get there because we keep voting in the coalition, which is just hastening the process. The stars are easier to blame, and as we've heard from my learned opponents tonight, we've done it for centuries. But if the stars were actually in control of our destiny, would any of you be here tonight? Would any of you be the person that you are? I was born from a one-night stand between a police officer and a barmaid. It was in Mount Gambier in a tiny town in South Australia. We won a prize home, which you would say was some destiny, which took me to the Gold Coast. Not just anywhere in the Gold Coast, but what we in Nerang like to call the Alabama of the Gold Coast. Should I be standing here in the National Portrait Gallery speaking to people who earn 3 times as much money as I do, working in the press gallery alongside people who earn about 5 times as much money as I do, reporting on politicians who decide all of your fates, at least from a policy point of view, who earn legitimately about 8 times more than I do? Should that have been my destiny? I think when you start to think about what the stars actually control, it's just a sense of hope and a wisp. It's a dream. It's something that we think of, well, this can't be my fault. But then all of you come forward and say, actually, yes, it is. I believe humanity is good. I believe that despite all that we see in the news and things that I report on Donald Trump and what's happening in the UK, in COVID and in wars, and your dog getting hit by a car, I believe that it is still the good of humanity that gets us through. And yes, we are to blame for a lot, and we do shit things. It's part of the human experience. But we also go to the stars. We also lift other people up. We make conscious choices every day to return the shopping trolley to where it belongs to help somebody else out. We put our rubbish in the bin because we know that that's the right thing to do. No one is directing us how to do that. We choose people to love. We choose how we raise people. We decide the world that we want to live in, and then we go about creating it. And if there is some giant star that is up there guiding us all, well, they're pretty busy, and they're also dead. Because every star that we look up in the sky, and there's only a couple of thousand really that we see, has come from millions and millions and millions of years ago. All we have is the here and now. And in the here and now, all we have are the decisions that you make. There is fault, but there is hope. There is mess, but there is beauty. And if the fault is in our stars, then you don't own any of that. And I think that's probably a really big tragedy.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you for wearing the Nerang High School jacket tonight, which reminds us that there is a state north of New South Wales called Queensland. Of course, anybody from Queensland, this is probably your worst nightmare. 80 people from New South Wales and Canberra all in a room at the same time. It's clearly not the vibe. Now, last and by no means least, a man often mentioned in this debate, perhaps sometimes where they played the man, not the ball. I would like to conclude tonight's debate with words that I've always wanted to say. I now call on the Minister for the Arts.
Friends, I know that bad things have happened in your life. I know that some of you have lost your job. I know that some of you may have been dumped by your partner. I know that maybe you've broken your leg or had another serious physical injury. You know, friends, the affirmative tonight has a very simple message for you, about all of those things. They're all your fault. They're all your fault. That is the affirmative's message to you, because the word fault in this topic, ladies and gentlemen, does an enormous amount of work. It doesn't just mean causality, it means being responsible for a bad thing. The affirmative is saying to you tonight, in a purse-lipped, gimlet-eyed, hand-wringing, blame-allocating, curtain-flicking, shaming, castigating, judging fashion, they are saying to every one of you, every bad thing that has ever happened to you is your fault. That is the message from this heartless pack of thin-lipped Victorian moralists, ladies and gentlemen, this evening. And we say, on the other hand, I mean, let's just look at what we heard from Professor Kenny. This cruel deception. He promised you the majestic possibilities of human endeavour. What he's really saying is if you're poor, it's your fault. Climate change, it's our fault. Disease is our fault. Death is our fault. It's all our fault. Being disabled or unskilled. This smooth language of empowerment we hear from this kind of new right advocate over here. Don't believe it for a second, ladies and gentlemen. I empower you is just a polite way of saying you're all on your own. And that is the cruel and deceptive message from this side of the House. On this side, ladies and gentlemen, what we say is this is wrong. You are not responsible. And why do we say this? First of all, because we care more. We're simply a kinder, gentler team than these purse-lipped Victorian moralists over here. But, you know, when Amy says it was her destiny, it was all random, it can't be my fault, Amy, it's not. It's not your fault. It is not your fault. Now, secondly, we say that our view of the topic is a view that recognises that this notion that humans control everything is hopelessly at odds with the facts. It assumes that we're at the centre of the universe, that the sun revolves around the earth. We say, have some humility, recognise our limits. We are a mere collection of atoms brought into existence through a 4 billion year process of evolution and natural selection on but one of billions of planets across the universe. We are not the towering masters of our own destiny that these fraudulent peddlers of myth on this side would have you believe. We are but mere specks of dust buffeted by great forces beyond our control, and we say it's okay to acknowledge that. That's all we're saying. That's all we're saying, ladies and gentlemen. And we also say that if you think about the endless litany of excuses and reasons proffered by human beings when something goes wrong, that is simply powerful proof that deep down we recognise it's all beyond our control. I had a difficult childhood. I have abandonment issues. My parents ignored me. My parents suffocated me. I'm a victim of systemic discrimination. I'm a victim of substance abuse. I have unresolved personal conflict issues. I was poorly advised. I was not adequately briefed. My briefing notes were too long and too complex. I was put into a role that I was not ready for. I was only following orders. I was only giving orders. It was the fog of war. I met a very nice man who just asked me to help him by carrying his suitcase through customs. Look, the affirmative will say to you, enough with this litany of excuses. They'll say, toughen up, man up, own the outcome, take the personal responsibility. We've heard all these tired and hackneyed phrases coming from them, but it's a false message. We say, these are not excuses. These are cries from the heart, from people saying, forces beyond my control led me to this outcome. I can't hold back the tides. I can't turn water into wine. I can't end world hunger or make evil go away. I simply can't do it. Now, you could listen to Mark and to Phyllida and Amy when they say, you can fly, so leap off of that precipice. You could do that. You can listen to them when they say, yes, you can be as tall and as rich and as good looking as you like. And if you're not, it's your fault. That is their message to you, ladies and gentlemen. And do not be deluded. Do not be deluded by this slick message of empowerment. Ask yourself, can they actually deliver? Now, this notion that we heard from Phyllida, that we can change everything, she said, we can change everything. And the hope of youth is wonderful. But this debate is not about how we'd like the world to be. This debate is about how the world is. And Phyllida, I'm sorry to say, but as the years go on, sadly, some of that youthful optimism is not going to stand up to gritty reality. Now, on our side, of course, we've had the argument from patron saints, and we've had the argument that all men are bastards. And I want to make it clear. That on our team we are as united as Mark Dreyfus and Joel Fitzgibbon. We are... So, ladies and gentlemen, you have to make a choice. And we'd love to believe, wouldn't we love to believe, that we can control everything, that we are masters of our own destiny, that we are mighty towering figures. But the fact is, ladies and gentlemen, that it's simply not true, and when the affirmative peddles this message, it's a cruel delusion. So we say, accept the negatives vision that admits humbly most of what happens we cannot control, and you know what? We're okay with that.
Accusations of puritanical Victorians. How far the left of the Liberal Party has come. So, now that we have heard from all 6 speakers, it is over to you, dear audience. Please take out your phones once again and vote again. Go to the app, go to the website, go to the QR code. Do it at home, whether you're in Alabama, Queensland, or other liberal parts of the world. And join us here in determining whether the fault is in the stars or in ourselves. While we do that, I've been asked to give you some questions. And to do that, I need my phone. So one moment. So the joy of this is that I get the questions filtered through from WhatsApp, and they're all from you. So, if the fault is in ourselves, oh, I'm so pleased to see someone else has fat thumbs. What of women who face obstacles to vote? Those countries such as Saudi Arabia and Oman. And I'm sure you agree there's only one person this question goes to. Virginia.
What is the question? No, I heard the latter part of it, but what was the beginning question?
If the fault is in ourselves, what of women who face obstacles to vote, such as those in Saudi Arabia and Oman?
Well, as our side has argued, the fault is actually not in yourselves. And for women who think that the fault is always theirs, there couldn't be a clearer message. The fault is not yours. But it's certainly the systems in which you live and work and the systems that oppress you and the foolish political systems that deny you a vote. And we know in Saudi Arabia, of course, recently, just very recently, they've allowed a vote for women in municipal elections, which was considered to be a great leap forward. Well, my God, it's the 21st century. God help us if that was a big leap forward. The problem is not you, dear women. Look to the right and look to the left of you and look to the person who is controlling where you live and how you live. There is the fault.
So there. So we have a question from Evie in Sydney. Peter, is this your daughter? Your 4-year-old?
My 5-year-old is asleep.
5-year-old. Right. She did graduate from her ELC today, so there you go. So why do you think people consistently blame our fault on the stars? Bruce?
Because it's easier than owning your responsibility. What's the history of religion? What's the history of any attempt for human beings to sort of understand why we're here and what the world is like? You need to have try to have some way of explaining it, And whether it's horoscopes or religion or whatever, that's what people grasp for when they simply can't see the total picture, and it's impossible to see the total picture.
It's that great quote from The Big Chill, you know, rationalisations are more important than sex. Well, think about it. Have you ever gone a week without a rationalisation? There we go. So our third question is love a product of fate or choice? Amy.
Well, that's a hard one. I would say that love is a choice. Who you love and in which direction you love is probably something you're born with. Well, it is something you're born with, but who you choose to love is a choice. And often we make the wrong ones. Often we see what we want to see, or we see who that person could be rather than who they are. But in the darkest of nights, we know exactly what we've done, we know exactly who that person is, and we sit there and we justify all of the reasons why we chose that person. I mean, when I was a teenager, you could have sent me a message at 11:11 and I would have taken it as a sign that we were meant to be. But I also would have desperately been looking for those signs to try and justify a relationship that I knew wasn't healthy for me. So it's a choice, not always the right one, but we know what we're doing.
I'm going to jump in there, though.
Ah.
Oh, surprise.
The debate has started.
No. Well, I just say this, I'll make this point. As a gay man who has been in a relationship now for 35 years, you know, the fact that I found the right person, to me, is remarkable. It's a miracle.
Is that person
And
similar to you?
Yeah, he is. But
So would you have been in the same groups of people?
sure, but there was a limited pool of people, is all I'm saying.
Well, of course there is.
I'm not...
But
Yes.
Can I just jump in there? How
I
do
think
you
I'm
know
going to need the bell.
that? How do you know that is the one person for you? I mean,
Are you
that's
fine?
But, well, I'm just opening the debate as I like to. But seriously, how do we know that the one person is that person? I do get upset when I hear particularly young girls talk about the one, and I think, no, there are going to be several. Some will work, some won't, but
You can work out over time. That you
oh yeah, no, it can work out over time. I don't
If you're one in a
disagree.
billion, there's still 7 others of you out there, so...
Yep.
One doesn't work, you'll find another.
Yes, or 6, depending on your... Yes, exactly. All right, and the last question, Phyllida. As you embark upon your journey in the world, having got your last assignment in on Friday, is it wise or foolhardy to believe in fate in this day and age?
I think it's foolhardy. I mean, the Minister spoke about the naivety of youth and the optimism of youth, but it's a fairly difficult time to be a young person and to see all of these problems. And I think that if you think that you can't do anything about it, it's fated to be, I think it is apathetic. I think that's why people don't want to participate in politics, because they don't see any point. And so, as I go forward, I would much prefer to think I could do something about it than not.
Philly, can I just tell you though, according to the almanac, your Neptune is really going to stuff you around next year.
I'm a
really badly.
You need to know though, I'm a Capricorn rising, because I'm born on the cusp of Sagittarius.
You are.
It's very important.
But you have a lot of Sagittarius in you, I can tell.
Okay, and with that,
Neptune.
I'm going to cut off Virginia from channeling her inner Channel 7.
Very important message here from the almanac. It actually says, and I'm not making this up, it actually says the best thing to do when Neptune buggers you around next year is to pause and have a cup of tea.
There you go.
It's in the almanac. It actually says
There you
this.
So, my gracious audience, it's crunch time. It's been an honour to be your host tonight. Thank you to all of you who have joined us, both here in the room and those of you who are watching on the web. And thank you particularly to our speakers tonight. As chair of the Development Committee at Bell Shakespeare, as the chief beggar, I know many of you have generously donated to Bell over the years, and I want to say thank you for all you've done tonight, and hopefully all that you're going to do for us in the future. Please visit our website, bellshakespeare.com.au, if you'd like to learn more about what we do. We do an extraordinary amount, and we only ever get these little windows of opportunity to tell you just a small portion of the things that we do. So please have a look and give generously. To announce the winner of tonight's debate, the second 2020 Bell Debate Series, it's my very great pleasure to invite Bell's Artistic Director, Mr. Peter Evans.
Thank you, Lachlan. Thank you, everybody. Just to pick up on Lachlan's beggar comment, I would like to borrow a little bit from infrastructure and change the language around arts funding and call it investment. Investment. A lot of you here have heard me talk about Julius Caesar in Canberra. It's an easy joke to make. The play is kind of relentlessly relevant. Normally when we talk about Julius Caesar, some leader of either party has just been knocked off. And I do say to Mr. Morrison that a lot of the views tonight are not those of Bell Shakespeare. They can own them themselves. But what I really liked tonight was actually you guys talking about Romeo and Juliet. And there's a couple of interesting things about that. Romeo and Juliet was written by Shakespeare after a plague shutdown of probably about a year. And Shakespeare went off and started writing sonnets, and he wrote his two very long poems, The Rape of Lucrece and Venus and Adonis. And in fact, it's probably safe to say that those two long poems actually made his name before the plays did. He became quite well known, mainly through those poems. And then he comes back and he writes Romeo and Juliet. And what does he do is that he makes the meeting between Romeo and Juliet a sonnet. They share 14 lines when they first meet. In American romantic comedies, it's called a meet-cute. And it's probably one of the greatest meet-cutes ever, is that these two young people, Romeo starts with a premise, and Juliet, because she's much smarter, as all the women in Shakespeare are, picks straight up on his premise, and they complete this beautiful sonnet that Romeo quite brilliantly gets himself 2 kisses out of. The other thing about Romeo and Juliet is it's actually a bit of an outlier because it's actually a tragedy of accidents. And I really am not trying to take either side of the argument in this because I think Phyllida is absolutely right that if there is any fault, it lies at the parents. But it is a tragedy of accidents. And sometimes we forget this, that one of the most important plot points in Romeo and Juliet is that the friar is meant to tell Romeo that Juliet is asleep, that she's not actually dead. But the message never gets to Romeo because Friar John, who's meant to deliver the message, is caught in a house that has the plague and he's quarantined. And I think before this year, that was the kind of plot point that we just put down to something ridiculous and convenient. If the numbers in London were over 30, the theatres were shut down. And as many of us have listened to Mr. Andrews on a daily basis, those numbers have become all too real. And again, I think we see an example of the plays reinventing themselves. And I think Romeo and Juliet there's a whole section of that play that becomes even more and more relevant. The last thing I wanted to say about Julius Caesar, which I think is central to Shakespeare and I think central to what's going on in America at the moment, the Romans were terrified of getting a king. They banished the Tarquin kings 500 years earlier, and they were terrified. And so they assassinated Caesar. They did what we would understand as a preemptive act of violence. They thought that it could be sacred, but it was actually brutal. And in Shakespeare, violence always begets violence. And so a civil war breaks out, and they end up with an emperor. They end up with something much, much scarier than a king, but just with a different name. And I think what's going on in the United States at the moment, and I have to credit the Democrats in the way they're handling this, is that it must be done with some kind of civility and calm, because otherwise violence will beget violence. To the debate. When we started the debate in the first vote, there was 89% agree. So are we agreeing with the affirmative? Is that what I mean? So we're with the affirmative 89% and 11% disagreed. At the end, 49% agreed and 51% disagreed. Now, I think that's truly fitting, because I have to say, I think this is the most extraordinary quality of debate. I cannot believe how good all 6 people were. It was absolutely astonishing, ridiculous in parts, but also very, very moving. And I think that that's probably a pretty fair... I want to thank everybody, and Lachlan, thank you. You've mangled more of Shakespeare tonight than I've heard throughout my career, and I appreciate that. This was a splendid... I really do thank the National... It's very cool for us to partner with the National Portrait Gallery, such a classy place. We really do love doing stuff here, and we hope to do many more. We're going to give some prizes. There will be prizes. Prizes for all for tonight, for our speakers. And the gallery has... we've got Brian here, Brian Brown in the look. And then we've also got the companion National Portrait Gallery. And we've got a bottle of Tyrrell's, because I think that's what we all need. So thank you, everybody. Thank you to the Portrait Gallery. Thanks for being part of it. Well done.